Aliens accept death, human trucker punches physics. The Star of Symmetry had been designed by mathematicians who believed that beauty and function were indistinguishable concepts, twin expressions of the same universal truth. Every curve of her hull followed the golden ratio. Her engines hummed in perfect harmonic resonance with the quantum foam of spacetime itself. The observation deck, where High Exarch Luminous now stood, was constructed from living crystal that refracted starlight into symphonies of color that could make lesser beings weep with joy. Right now, it refracted only darkness. The rogue black hole filled the viewport like a wound in reality itself, not the supermassive, galaxy-anchoring kind that civilizations could chart and avoid. No, this was a stellar mass wanderer, a cosmic predator that had drifted through the void for eons before finding them. The accretion disk glowed with the tortured light of matter being torn apart at the molecular level, screaming its death song in X-rays and gamma radiation. Luminous's crystalline form pulsed with bioluminescent equations, probability matrices cascading across his faceted surface like tears. The math was absolute, inescapable. Their main engines had failed 3 cycles ago, a statistical impossibility that had nevertheless occurred, because the universe cared nothing for impossibility when entropy demanded satisfaction. The backup systems had fired exactly once before the gravitational shear tore them from their mountings. They were falling. "The equation is balanced," Luminous whispered, his voice like wind chimes in a funeral procession. Around him, the bridge crew, each a masterwork of evolutionary refinement, beings who could calculate orbital mechanics in their heads while composing poetry, had ceased their desperate calculations. What was the point? The math said they had 17 minutes before crossing the event horizon. After that, they would be spaghettified, their elegant molecular structures stretched into infinitely thin strands of screaming matter. Some were already composing their death songs. Engineer Prismata had begun a light symphony about the beauty of entropy, each photon carefully modulated to express her acceptance of the void. Navigator Quartz was calculating the exact moment their atoms would be crushed into quantum foam, finding strange comfort in the precision of their doom. Luminous activated the distress beacon one final time. Not because he expected rescue, the probability of another ship being within range was 0.0000003%, and the probability of that ship being insane enough to approach an active black hole was functionally 0, but because protocol demanded it. Because even in death, the Xylophians honored order. "To any who receive this transmission," he began, his voice carrying the weight of species memory and mathematical certainty, "we are the Star of Symmetry, Registry HFY 7734, carrying 347 souls. We have been caught in the gravity well of an uncharted stellar mass black hole at coordinates." He rattled off the numbers with the precision of the dying. "Our engines are non-functional. Our trajectory is terminal. We apologize for the disorder our destruction will cause to local spacetime. May our atoms find more elegant arrangements in whatever comes next. We return to the void with grace." He closed the channel. 17 minutes. 16 now. He began composing his own death poem, something about the inevitability of darkness and the foolishness of believing that consciousness mattered in a universe governed by thermodynamics. Then the proximity alarm screamed. 300,000 kilometers away, Captain Russell, Rusty, Miller was having a significantly less philosophical experience with mortality. Specifically, he was trying to decide if the ham sandwich he'd made that morning had too much mustard. It definitely had too much mustard. The cockpit of the ugly duckling smelled like recycled air, old gym socks, and the particular brand of industrial solvent that Rusty used to clean the fuel injectors. The ship herself was a consolidated mining tugboat, Model 7, a design that had been considered obsolete 20 years ago and was now considered a war crime against aesthetics. She was 70 meters of welded steel plating, illegal engine modifications, and what Rusty's insurance adjuster had described as a flagrant disregard for the laws of physics and common sense. Rusty loved her like a man loves a truck that's never quite died on him, despite his best efforts. He was slouched in the pilot's seat, boots up on the console, watching the long-range sensors paint their boring picture of empty space. He was 3 days into a 6-day haul of refined titanium ore from the Kepler belt to the inner colonies, and he was already sick of the trip. The autopilot was handling the flying. The coffee maker was broken again. And this sandwich, this goddamn sandwich, was a mustard crime scene. The distress call interrupted his lunch. At first, he almost ignored it. Distress calls in deep space were usually either pirates trying to lure in good Samaritans or some rich asshole who'd run out of champagne and considered it an emergency. But the signal was coming from close by, relatively speaking, and Rusty's mama hadn't raised a complete bastard. He wiped mustard off his shirt unsuccessfully, sat up, and pulled up the signal analysis. To any who receive this transmission, we are the Star of Symmetry. Rusty's eyebrows went up. He knew that name. Xylophonian luxury liner. The kind of ship that catered to beings who thought regular starlight was too pedestrian and needed it filtered through artisanal crystals or some shit. The kind of ship that had more money in its gift shop than Rusty made in a year. Caught in the gravity well of an uncharted stellar mass black hole. Oh hell. Rusty pulled up the tactical display. There they were, one luxury liner, dead in the water, falling ass first into a black hole that his sensors were painting in cheerful red warning colors. The math was ugly. They had maybe 15 minutes before they crossed the point of no return. He should keep flying. This wasn't his problem. Black holes were the kind of thing that smart people avoided, and Rusty had never claimed to be smart. He was a trucker with a spaceship. His job was to haul cargo from point A to point B without dying or getting arrested, and he was only marginally successful at both. But, salvage rights on a Xylophonian luxury liner would pay better than 5 years of hauling ore. And if he could pull off a rescue, an actual, honest-to-God rescue from a black hole, the insurance payout alone would let him retire. Buy a bar somewhere. Drink himself to death in comfort instead of in the cockpit of a ship held together by spite and illegal welds. Ah hell, Rusty muttered, setting down his sandwich. I'm gonna be late for the drop-off. He cracked his knuckles, killed the autopilot, and started punching in calculations. Not the elegant mathematics of the Xylophonians. Rusty had barely passed high school algebra. No, these were the ugly, practical calculations of a man who'd spent 20 years flying ships through places they weren't supposed to go. Fuel consumption, engine stress, probability of catastrophic failure. That last one was high, real high. This better be worth the fuel, Rusty said to nobody in particular, and slammed the warp drive into a configuration that would have made any safety inspector weep. The ugly duckling shuddered, groaned, and prepared to do something profoundly stupid. Standard operating procedure for warp travel near massive gravitational bodies was simple. Don't. The curvature of spacetime made warp fields unstable, prone to collapse, and likely to deposit your ship somewhere between, inside a star and smeared across 3 dimensions. Every spacefaring species had learned this lesson, usually the hard way. Rusty had learned it, he just didn't care. He'd done the math, his version of math anyway, which involved a lot of gut feeling and the kind of intuition you developed after 20 years of not dying. The black hole's gravity well was steep, yeah, but it was also predictable. Smooth. And if he could punch a warp bubble into existence right at the edge of the well, he could ride the gradient down like a surfer catching a wave. Probably. Maybe. Fuck it, Rusty said, which was his version of a pre-flight prayer, and engaged the warp drive. The universe screamed. That's what it sounded like to Rusty, anyway, a sound that wasn't really a sound, more like the feeling of reality being torn open and violated. The warp field collapsed around the ugly duckling like a fist, compressing space in front of the ship and expanding it behind. For 3 seconds that felt like 3 hours, Rusty existed in a state that human neurology wasn't designed to process. Then they were through. The ugly duckling slammed back into real space with all the grace of a brick thrown through a window. Alarms shrieked. The hull groaned. Rusty's teeth rattled in his skull as the inertial dampeners tried and failed to compensate for the violence of their arrival. But they were there, right next to the Star of Symmetry, close enough that Rusty could see the elegant curves of her hull on visual sensors. Close enough that the Zolophians could see him. On the bridge of the Star of Symmetry, High Exarch Luminous was experiencing something that his species had no word for, because they had never needed one. Absolute, gibbering terror mixed with complete cognitive dissonance. One moment they had been alone with their death, composing final symphonies and calculating the exact angle at which their molecules would be torn apart. The next moment, something had appeared next to them. Not arrived, not decelerated from warp, appeared, like a demon summoned from the deepest pit of chaos. The ship, if it could be called a ship, was an abomination. 70 meters of industrial ugliness, covered in mismatched hull plating and leaking radiation from at least 3 different points. It was vibrating, visibly, as if its engines were trying to shake themselves apart and only barely failing. What? Prismata began, her light song stuttering into incoherence. What is that? The communications panel chirped. A voice came through, rough and gravelly, speaking in the trade pidgin that most species used for commerce. Yo, Crystal Ship, you folks still alive in there? Luminous stared at the communications panel as if it had just asked him to divide by 0. Yes, we are alive, for approximately 11 more minutes. Who, what? Name's Miller, Captain Miller. Saw your distress call, figured I'd swing by see if I could help. Help? Luminous felt his probability matrices shattering like dropped glass. Captain Miller, we are caught in an inescapable gravity well. The mathematics are absolute. There is no help. There is only. Yeah, I saw the black hole. Big scary space butthole, very impressive. Look, you want help or you want to keep doing the math on your own death, 'cause I got a schedule to keep. Luminous looked at his crew. They looked back at him, their crystalline faces reflecting the same impossible question. Was this human insane, or were they already dead and this was some kind of entropy-induced hallucination? What is your plan? Luminous asked carefully. Plan? Oh buddy, you're gonna hate this. Your tractor beams still work. No, all external systems are offline. Course they are. Okay, plan B, I'm gonna ram you. Silence. The kind of silence that occurs when an entire bridge crew simultaneously tries to process a statement that violates every principle of physics, safety, and sanity. You're going to what? Prismata shrieked, her light song hitting frequencies that could shatter glass. Ram you. Well, more like a controlled collision. I'm gonna hit your hull with my reinforced nose, change your vector just enough to buy us some time. Then I'm gonna blow up my cargo. Your cargo? Yeah, I'm hauling mining explosives. Volatile as hell, which is why they pay me the big bucks to move them. I'm gonna jettison the containers toward the black hole and detonate them. The shockwave should give us enough push to break free of the gravity well. Luminous felt something inside his crystalline matrix crack. Not physically, metaphorically. It was the sound of his entire worldview, built on mathematics and probability and the elegant certainty of physics, collapsing into dust. That's not how physics works, he whispered. Sure it is. Newton's third law, buddy. Every action, equal and opposite reaction. I'm gonna make a really big action, and we're gonna ride the reaction right out of here. The stress on our hull, the g-forces, the probability of catastrophic structural failure, is less than 100%, which is better odds than you got now. So stow the math and buckle up. This is gonna bump. The communications channel cut off. Luminous stood frozen, his mind racing through probability matrices that no longer made sense. The human was going to ram them, with a ship that looked like it had been assembled by blind welders during an earthquake, and then blow up a cargo hold full of mining explosives. It was the stupidest plan he had ever heard. It was also their only chance. "All crew," he said, his voice somehow steady despite the impossibility of everything, "brace for impact. Secure all loose objects, and pray to whatever gods govern chaos." Because the Xylophans had gods for order, for mathematics, for the elegant dance of entropy. But they had never needed a god for this. For the first time in their history, they were about to be rescued by a human. They were about to learn what that meant. Rusty lined up the shot like he was parallel parking a semi-truck in a space meant for a sedan. The Star of Symmetry was drifting, her elegant hull rotating slowly in the grip of tidal forces that would eventually tear her apart. He needed to hit her at just the right angle, hard enough to change her vector, gentle enough not to crack her open like an egg. Gentle being a relative term when you were ramming a luxury liner with a tugboat. He'd reinforced the ugly duckling's nose cone years ago, back when he'd been doing salvage work in asteroid fields and needed to push dead ships around. The reinforcement was technically illegal, something about excessive structural modifications and disregard for mass distribution safety. But it meant his ship could take a hit that would crumple most civilian vessels. Time to find out if most included Xylophian luxury liners. "All right, baby," Rusty muttered, patting the console like it was a loyal dog. "Let's do something stupid." He fired the maneuvering thrusters. The ugly duckling lurched forward, accelerating toward the Star of Symmetry at a speed that was either precisely calculated or way too fucking fast, depending on whether you asked Rusty or any qualified engineer. The distance closed, 500 meters, 300, 100. Rusty could see the individual crystal panels of the luxury liner's hull now, each one a masterwork of engineering and artistry. Shame he was about to smash into them. 50 meters. 20. Impact. The sound was indescribable, a grinding, shrieking cacophony of metal on crystal, of two ships that were never meant to touch colliding at relative velocity. Rusty's teeth slammed together hard enough to chip enamel. The inertial dampeners screamed in protest, failing to compensate for the sudden deceleration. His vision went red at the edges as blood vessels burst in his eyes. But the ugly duckling held. Her reinforced nose crumpled but didn't break, and the Star of Symmetry. The luxury liner's hull cracked, not catastrophically but enough that Rusty could see crystal shards spinning away into the void, glittering like diamonds in the light of the accretion disk. Enough that the ship's rotation changed, her vector shifting by precious degrees. Not enough. They were still falling, just falling slightly sideways now. "Phase 2, Rusty grunted, tasting blood. He kept the throttle pinned, the ugly duckling's engines screaming as they pushed against the luxury liner's mass. The two ships were locked together now, nose to flank, grinding against each other as Rusty fought to change their trajectory. The G-forces were brutal. Rusty's nose was bleeding freely now, blood floating in zero-G droplets that the life support system frantically tried to filter. His ribs ached. His vision was tunneling. But the numbers on his display were changing. Slowly, painfully, they were moving. Just not fast enough. The black hole's gravity was absolute. For every meter they climbed, they fell 2. The event horizon was 8 minutes away. 7, 6. Time for the stupid part. Rusty activated the cargo bay release. Behind the ugly duckling, the bay doors opened, and 20 containers of mining explosives, each one containing enough shaped charges to crack open an asteroid, tumbled out into space. They drifted for a moment, caught in the same gravitational current that was pulling the ships down. Then Rusty fired the maneuvering thrusters one more time, pushing the containers away from the ships, toward the black hole. "Come on," he whispered. "Come on, you beautiful bastards." He waited. 3 seconds. 5. The containers were falling faster now, accelerating toward the event horizon, pulled by gravity that would eventually crush them into quantum foam. Rusty hit the detonator. 20 containers of military-grade mining explosives detonated simultaneously, creating a fireball that briefly outshone the accretion disk. The explosion was massive, a sphere of superheated plasma expanding at a significant fraction of the speed of light, carrying enough kinetic energy to move mountains. Or in this case, 2 ships. The shockwave hit them like the fist of an angry god. On the bridge of the Star of Symmetry, High Exarch Luminous experienced what humans would call the worst roller coaster ride in history, and what Xylofians would call a fundamental violation of everything we hold sacred. The explosion hit them from behind, and suddenly they were accelerating. Not the gentle, calculated acceleration of a properly functioning engine. This was violence, pure kinetic chaos. The ship bucked like a living thing, her hull groaning as forces she was never designed to handle tried to tear her apart. Luminous was thrown against his restraints hard enough to crack his crystalline matrix. Around him, the bridge crew was screaming, not in words, but in pure light, their bioluminescence flashing in patterns of terror and disbelief. The human ship was still attached to them, still pushing, and now they were riding a wave of fire and plasma away from the event horizon. The G-forces were impossible. Luminous could feel his molecular structure straining, bonds stretching to their breaking point. They were going to die. The math said so. The stress on the hull exceeded safety margins by factors of 10, 20, 50. They were going to shake apart, or the human ship was going to crush them, or the black hole was going to catch them anyway, and this would all be for nothing. But they weren't dying. Somehow, impossibly, they were accelerating. The numbers on the navigation display were changing, the vector shifting from terminal descent to barely controlled ascent. They were climbing out of the gravity well, surfing an explosion like it was a goddamn wave. It was the most reckless, violent, stupid piece of flying Luminous had ever witnessed. It was working. In the cockpit of the ugly duckling, Rusty was laughing, or maybe screaming. It was hard to tell the difference when you were pulling GS that would have killed a normal person, and your ship was shaking so hard that the bolts were coming loose. The explosion had worked, better than he'd hoped, honestly. They were riding the shockwave, using the plasma as a cushion between them and the black hole's pull. The luxury liner was still attached to his nose, and together they were clawing their way up the gravity gradient like a drunk man climbing a ladder. The hull was screaming. Alarms were blaring from every system. The reactor was redlining. The engines were running at 140% capacity, and Rusty was pretty sure he could smell something burning. But the numbers were good. The vector was good. They were going to make it. "Come on, you bucket of bolts," Rusty shouted at his ship, at the universe, at the black hole itself. "Hold together, just a little longer." The G-forces peaked. Rusty's vision went gray, then black at the edges. His hands were locked on the controls, knuckles white, fighting to keep the ship steady as they rode the knife's edge between escape and annihilation. And then they were through. The gravity released them like a predator losing interest in prey that fought too hard. The ugly duckling and the Star of Symmetry, still locked together, tumbled out of the black hole's grip and into the relatively calm space beyond. Rusty cut the engines. The sudden silence was deafening. For a long moment he just sat there, breathing hard, tasting blood and adrenaline. His hands were shaking. His whole body was shaking. Then he started laughing. Real laughter this time, the kind that came from surviving something that should have killed you. "Holy shit," he said to the empty cockpit. "Holy shit, that actually worked." Behind him, The black hole continued its eternal feast, uncaring that 2 ships had just escaped its hunger. Rusty wiped blood from his nose, checked his systems, and opened a comm channel to the luxury liner. "Yo, Crystal Ship, you folks still in one piece?" The response took a moment. When it came, the Xylofian's voice was shaking. Yes, we are intact, mostly. Captain Miller, what you just did was. Yeah, I know. Stupid, reckless, violated about 40 safety regulations. You're welcome. Now you got a docking port that still works. We should probably separate our ships before something else breaks. Another pause, then, yes, docking port 7 is functional, Captain Miller. Thank you. Rusty grinned, even though the alien couldn't see it. Thank me with coffee and a damage assessment, and maybe a check for the cargo I just blew up. That shit was expensive. He started maneuvering the ugly duckling toward the docking port, already mentally calculating how much he could charge for this rescue. It was going to be a good payday. Assuming the Xylofians didn't die of shock first. The Star of Symmetry's bridge was a study in contrasts. On one side, elegant crystalline architecture, soft bioluminescent lighting, and the kind of aesthetic perfection that took centuries of cultural refinement to achieve. On the other side, Captain Russell Miller, who looked like he'd been in a bar fight with a black hole and lost. Rusty was covered in blood, his own mostly, from the nosebleed and the dozen small cuts he'd acquired during the rescue. His jumpsuit was stained with grease, hydraulic fluid, and what might have been mustard from that sandwich he'd abandoned. He smelled like sweat, ozone, and the particular funk of a man who'd been living in a spaceship for 3 days without showering. He stood in the middle of the pristine bridge like a turd on a wedding cake. The Xylofians stared at him, all of them, 347 pairs of crystalline eyes, reflecting his image back at him in fractured, horrified multiplicity. High Exarch Luminous approached slowly, as if Rusty might explode if startled. His crystalline form was cracked in several places, stress fractures running through his matrix like lightning frozen in glass. But he was alive. They were all alive. "Captain Miller," Luminous began, his voice carrying the weight of someone trying to process the impossible. "You saved us." Rusty shrugged. "Did a job, you folks called for help, I helped, that's how it works." But the mathematics, the probability of success, was better than 0, which is what you had before I showed up. Rusty pulled a datapad from his pocket, wincing as the movement pulled at his bruised ribs. "Speaking of which, we should talk about payment. I lost 20 containers of mining explosives, my ship's nose is crumpled, and I'm gonna be late on my delivery contract. So I'm thinking." "You want payment?" Prismata's voice was shrill, her light song hitting frequencies that made Rusty's teeth ache. "You nearly killed us. The stress on our hull, the G-forces, we could have been torn apart." "But you weren't," Rusty pointed out reasonably. "You're alive. Little banged up, sure, but alive. Which is better than being spaghettified inside a black hole, yeah." Luminous held up a crystalline hand, silencing Prismata. His eyes, if they could be called eyes, studied Rusty with an intensity that was almost physical. "You broke every law of safety," Luminous said slowly. "You performed a warp jump inside a gravity well. You rammed our ship. You weaponized a catastrophe. By all mathematical models, we should be dead. You should be dead. The probability of success wasn't 0, Rusty interrupted. "Look, I get it. You folks like your math, your probabilities, your elegant solutions. That's fine. But sometimes the universe doesn't give you elegant solutions. Sometimes you gotta punch it in the face and see what happens." "That's insane." "That's humanity." Rusty grinned, showing teeth that were slightly bloody. "We're real good at doing stupid shit and surviving. It's kind of our thing." Luminous was silent for a long moment. Around him, the bridge crew was processing this information, their bioluminescence flickering in patterns that Rusty couldn't read but suspected meant something like, "Holy shit, these apes are terrifying." You could have died, Luminous said finally. The risk to yourself was enormous. Why did you do it? Rusty considered the question. He could tell them about the salvage rights, about the money, about the practical reasons that had motivated him to take the job. But looking at their faces, their crystalline, mathematical, utterly alien faces, he realized they wouldn't understand that. So he told them a different truth. Because you called for help, Rusty said simply, and I was close enough to answer, that's all. The silence that followed was profound. The Zalophians looked at each other, communicating in flashes of light too fast for Rusty to follow. He got the sense that he'd just said something significant, though he wasn't sure what. Finally, Luminous nodded, a gesture he'd probably learned from dealing with other species. We will pay your fee, Captain Miller, and we will remember this. What you did, what your species is capable of. Great, awesome. You got any coffee, black if you have it, and maybe a donut? Prismata made a sound like breaking glass. Coffee. You just survived a black hole encounter and you want coffee. Yeah, well, it's been a long day, and I'm gonna need the caffeine for the trip back. Still got a delivery to make. Luminous gestured to one of the crew members, who scurried off and returned a moment later with a crystalline container filled with liquid. Rusty took it, sniffed it, and grimaced. This is water. Purified nutrient water, Luminous corrected, distilled from. It's not coffee. We do not consume stimulants. They interfere with our probability calculations. Course they do. Rusty sighed and took a sip anyway. It tasted like nothing perfectly pure, perfectly bland, perfectly disappointing. Well, it's wet anyway. He drained the container, handed it back, and turned toward the docking port. All right, I'm gonna get my ship detached and head out. You folks should be fine from here. Your engines are shot, but you're out of the gravity well. Send a distress call to your people, they'll come get you. And, maybe get those hull cracks looked at. Structural integrity's important. Captain Miller, Luminous called as Rusty reached the door. One more question. Rusty turned back. Yeah. Are all humans like you? Rusty thought about it. Thought about the truckers and miners and salvage crews he'd worked with over the years. Thought about the kind of people who looked at the vast, cold, uncaring universe and decided to make a living in it anyway. Pretty much, he said. We're all crazy, just in different ways. He left the bridge, leaving behind a crew of aliens who were alive, traumatized, and profoundly terrified of humanity. 3 hours later, the ugly duckling was back on course, limping toward the inner colonies with a crumpled nose and a reactor that was making concerning noises. Rusty was back in his pilot's seat, boots on the console, eating a fresh sandwich. This one had the right amount of mustard. His datapad pinged with an incoming transfer, the payment from the Zalophians. He glanced at the number and whistled. It was good, real good, enough to cover the lost cargo, the repairs, and maybe even that bar he'd been thinking about. He pulled up the long-range sensors, checking for any other distress calls. The display was empty, just him and the void and the long haul home. Another day, another $1, Rusty muttered, and took a bite of his sandwich. Behind him, light years away, the black hole continued its eternal feast. It would be there long after Rusty was dead, long after humanity was dust, long after the last star burned out and the universe went cold. But today it had lost. Today, a human with a tugboat and a bad attitude had looked at the inevitable and said, nah. And that, in the end, was what made humanity terrifying. Not their technology, not their weapons, not their ships or their math or their elegant solutions. Their refusal to accept that anything was impossible. Their absolute, stubborn, idiotic insistence that the universe could be punched in the face. High Exarch Luminous, sitting in his damaged bridge, surrounded by his traumatized crew, calculated the probability that humanity would one day be a threat to galactic stability. The number came back as 100%. he decided not to share that with anyone. Some things he was learning were better left as uncertainty. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this story, consider subscribing for more journeys. Share your thoughts in the comments and stay tuned for the next adventure.